Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, what do you call a country which kills an icon anti-terrorist fighter? Lieutenant Qasem Soleimani was loved by the people of the region as a true freedom fighter protecting Christians, Muslims, and those of other religions or having no religion at all. He led the fight against the head-cutting, heart-eating Daesh terrorists. So if the U.S. was really fighting Daesh, why would Washington want to kill the man who fought the terrorists most successfully, unless Washington wasn't really Daesh's enemy? On Saturday, the leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, met with Soleimani's family to honor him. He said Soleimani represents the secret of endurance and victory, adding his danger to the enemies now that he is a martyr is even greater than when he was alive.
امروز شهید سلیمانی در منطقه ما نماد امید و اعتماد به نفس، نماد رشادت، رمز استقامت و پیروزی است. یه نفری گفته بود که شهید سلیمانی برای دشمنانش خطرناکتر از سردار سلیمانی است. درست فهمیده بود. اونهایی که 2 سال پیش شهید سلیمانی رو و شهید عزیز ابو مهدی عزیز رو و دیگر همراهانشون رو به شهادت رسوندن، فکر میکردن کار تمام شد. فکر میکردن زدیم اینها رو تمام شد، خلاص شد. امروز وضع اونها رو نگاه کنید، ببینید در چه وضعی هستند. وضع آمریکا رو ببینید، از افغانستان اونجور فرار میکنه، در عراق ناچاره که تظاهر به خروج کنه. حالا باید البته برادران عراقی هوشیارانه مسئله رو دنبال کنن. مجبوره که بگه من نقش مستشاری بعد از این ایفا خواهم کرد، یعنی اقرار کنه به اینکه اونجا حضور نظامی نمیخواد داشته باشه و نمیتوانه داشته باشه. مسئله یمن رو ملاحظه کنید، مسئله لبنان رو نگاه کنید. جریان ضد استکباری در منطقه، جریان مقاومت در منطقه امروز از 2 سال پیش پر رونق‌تر و شادابتر و امیدوارتر داره حرکت میکنه و کار میکنه. در سوریه هم زمینگیر شدن اینها. در سوریه هم هیچ امیدی برای آیندهشون نیست.
I'd like to welcome my guests to this program. Jim Kavanagh, writer and political commentator out of New York. Said Mohsen Abbas, journalist and political commentator out of London. Well, welcome both of you to the program. I'm going to start off in London with Said Mohsen. Said Mohsen, if you were to describe Qasem Soleimani, if you were to say who he was, how would you introduce him? What would you say about him?
Well, I think all accounts of those who worked with him, who lived with him, who died for him as well in many ways, all speak of a man who was deeply spiritual, deeply committed to the oppressed, deeply committed to creating a better world. And that kind of commitment, that heartfelt spiritual commitment, was really one which comes obviously from his own religious background, his commitment to the idea of fighting oppression wherever one finds it. This is from Imam Hussein alayhi salam. This is from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. These are the figures that Qasem Soleimani would have held as his role models. And he lived his life in a way which was, for me, really, we talk about warrior saints of the past. But for me, I think if anybody embodies that term of warrior saint in the modern contemporary area, very hard to find anybody who fits that bill. But if anybody did, it has to be Lieutenant General Qasem Soleimani for me, because he not only lived a pious life, he put his life on the line virtually throughout his time since his joining of the IRGC in 1979, through the war in Iran and Iraq war, in which he fought bravely to all accounts, and on to his extraterritorial missions further with the Quds Force, which he embarked upon in the late 90s. And the evidence on the ground tells you, when you go and actually talk to people on the ground, and those people who were oppressed, who were being sort of bludgeoned into submission, the Yemenis, the Syrians, the Lebanese, the Iraqis, all across that West Asia region, Haji Soleimani's stamp is there, and is constantly, consistently for protecting the oppressed. This is the man he was.
Okay. Well, Jim, you've just heard Said Mohsen describe Lieutenant General Soleimani, and of course Said Mohsen is not in Iran, and he's not even Iranian, and so many people throughout the region and in much of the world would probably describe him in the same way. With that being said, what was the main problem that the United States had with such a man?
Well, Lieutenant General Soleimani was an extremely effective organizer of the resistance throughout the region. You know, this is what made him, I mean, he was almost, I presume, and certainly motivated by the kind of personal convictions that we just heard, but he put that into practice in an extremely effective way. He was the one who came in and mobilized the popular mobilization forces in Iraq that saved Iraq cities from being overrun by Daesh, ISIS. And it's because, and he helped to organize the resistance to invasion and by Daesh, ISIS, and other groups in Syria. So for the purposes of the United States and Israel, he was a very effective enemy. And he was able to do this because people trusted him. And even American commanders know this. They know he was a very effective leader, and he was able to mobilize people and get them working together to fight and to stop the advance of these, as you say, head-chopping Daesh, ISIS forces. So, but he was also, in doing that, organizing groups that would be effective in resistance against Israeli and American aggression. So because of that, the Israelis wanted him to go, and the United States took them out for him. And, you know, there were two, actually. One should be aware, there was another attempted assassination the same day of an Iranian advisor in Yemen. So this was a part of a military strategy that mirrors the Israeli strategy of killing Iranian scientists. This was kill the most effective military leaders, those who are the most effective at organizing resistance throughout the region. And that is really the real target of all the American and Israeli aggression now. It's not nuclear weapons, which don't exist. It's Iranian influence in organizing resistance in a number of countries to Israeli and American aggression.
Well, Said Mohsen, now some people think that the assassination of General Soleimani was something that former U.S. President Donald Trump unilaterally ordered. I want to talk about that side of things because that's not really the case. I mean, we saw even Joe Biden, it wasn't that he was sorry that it was happening. He was just concerned of possible effects after that took place. Your take in general that, you know, Washington had basically labeled him #1 nemesis in the region.
Well, you're absolutely correct in saying that Donald Trump alone is not responsible for what was carried out, this terrorist act. That's the only way to describe it, because whether you're a state or whether you're an individual or an organization, you carry out extrajudicial killings, that's terrorism by any definition. And the United Nations has pretty much their rapporteur who did the investigation on this whole incident, the extrajudicial killings rapporteur, described it as unlawful and arbitrary. So, first of all, the entire American machine, the entire what I call Zio-Western imperialist machine, industrial military arms complex, call it what you like, has a say in this dirty business of murdering Qasem Soleimani. Now, the fact is that you know, the Americans and the Israelis have given themselves a carte blanche. They've committed to something the Iranians today described as excessive unilateralism, granting themselves effectively the power to violate any international law and agreement. Now, once that precedent has been set, it means that we're on globally on a path towards war on a scale potentially that we've never witnessed before. Because if this is allowed to become the norm, then what stops Russia, China, anybody else wanting to also do the same and expect to get away with it? I mean, Iran has called on the UN to take formal action. They said that their legal department, in fact, of the Iranian presidential office, has said all legal initiatives in its power, the UN that it's referring to, should be used to condemn US actions and to discourage similar moves in the future.
So do you think that that's going to happen, though?
Well, the thing is, my opinion generally on the United Nations, that all of these organizations, these so-called international organizations, largely get funding either from the US or their partners, and a combination of the corporate, financial, private corporate world. Both of those entities are part and parcel of what I call, or what Ayatollah Khamenei calls, the global arrogance, which actually perpetrates plunder, rape, pillaging of all of these lands in the first place. So it's a bit like going back to the rapist as one who's raped and expects justice from him. This is literally what, for me, the UN is. It's just an extension. It's another, if you like, institution of power, or a power institution used by the same elitist forces to subjugate the independent nations like Iran, Venezuela.
Well, let me get Jim
Iraq,
back in this conversation. The same question. Do you think that, because Iran is perhaps going to try to, when they talked about the legal ramifications and trying to get those who are responsible to an international court, how likely do you think that that's to happen, Jim?
Short answer, very unlikely, for all the reasons just described. And, that doesn't mean they shouldn't do it, because along the way, you're going to get rulings and decisions that are going to, buttress your case and make clear the outrageousness of what happened. Okay, don't forget, this was a meeting that Donald Trump, the president of the United States, asked the president of Iraq to arrange between Mohandy and Soleimani to discuss peaceful settlements of things. And it was in that context that both the state representative of Iran and the state representative of Iraq were killed by an American strike. This is calling for a parlay of peace and then shooting the people who come to the table. It's absolutely outrageous. But the American government now has instituted, even forget about it, the United Nations. They don't even bother with the United Nations very much. They have what they called the rules-based international order, which is essentially we make the rules and you follow our orders. And they have given themselves, and Israel certainly, impunity to do whatever we want. We see Israel almost daily bombing Syria. There's absolutely no justification. It's completely illegal. So things like this, things like murdering two state representatives you've called on to meet together, and bombing sovereign countries like Syria daily and weekly, are things that are never brought up before the so-called international community, because ultimately the United Nations is controlled by states. But they don't even get into that venue because the United States doesn't care about that anymore.
Well, Said Mohsen, immediately following the terrorist strike, people started calling for the U.S. to leave the region. Let's look at what has happened to the U.S. in this region since then. I mean, if we look at Afghanistan or we look at Iraq, your overall assessment of what has happened to the United States since that time.
Well, what's happened is really the defeat of the Americans has been absolute in Afghanistan, at least militarily speaking. They're certainly not there in the way that they would have liked to have been, totally in control of Afghanistan. So they've lost, if you like, their card, if you like, against Iran in the east. That was the border. The Afghan border was one that they were hoping to occupy and cause problems for Iran from there. They've failed in Iraq because what we've seen is that there is an overwhelming, if you like, feeling, both democratically within the political circles and the people at large that the Americans are an occupying force in Iraq, and there's no need for them to be there. They were so-called brought in to deal with ISIS and Daesh. They never really did that. It was, again, Qasem Soleimani, General Soleimani, who moved in rapidly in places like Mosul and Tikrit and held up the ISIS advance, which, many analysts and journalists and others who've researched say very clearly was something which the Americans, in fact, were backing. The ISIS invasion into Iraq was part of that. And it is Qasem Soleimani who stopped and thwarted their plans there. So the fact of the matter is that in Iraq, they've also lost. In Syria, since then, of course, what's happened is this cumulative international feeling that the Americans are a rogue state. I mean, even their own partners are struggling to keep up within NATO. They're almost like having to be forced to continue the alliance because the Americans were demanding money and are wanting even more, if you like, efforts from the Europeans to go along these kind of crazy imperialist plans in the Middle East in particular. So that alliance has definitely frayed, and I think Iran's stand has definitely helped that. Of course, it made Iran and Iranian people wake up in case they were going to sleep on the job, because after the death of the Lieutenant General, the public unanimously voted in a conservative establishment, as the West would put it. You know, Ayatollah Raisi is somebody who's not to be messed around with and would give the West very little room in negotiations on the JCPOA and many other issues. So what we've seen is that Iran itself, by the action, this kind of rather ridiculously stupid action by the Americans, rallied the Iranian people around the establishment.
Okay.
So it was kind of a shot in the foot there as well. I mean, I could go on.
All right, stay with me, Said Mohsen. I know you could go on, and I would love to hear you, but I'm limited with the time. Jim, do you think that the targeted assassination by the U.S. lifted the facade for some that Washington was really in the region to fight the terrorists, or not? Do you think that most people realize that by now? Or is it because of the mainstream media, perhaps they really still think that the U.S. was trying to fight Daesh? Your assessment.
Well, I think in the world, certainly that was a major element of the disillusion with anybody who still had disillusion about what the United States was doing. As we've said, Soleimani was one of the most effective. Nobody was more effective as a personal leader in fighting Daesh and ISIS. And that didn't make any difference to the Americans. If anything, it was a negative. So I think that most of the world, by the time of the Soleimani assassination, certainly once it happened, not only the Soleimani assassination, but Mohandi also said, the Americans, they've lost complete, no faith in any notion that the Americans are there for democracy or to fight terrorism or anything else but to force compliance with American imperialism and Zionism. So I think that's now in the United States, it's a little different. And I think a lot more people in the United States, not necessarily because of the Soleimani assassination, but that's going to be one of the things, but also just because of the general obvious failures in terms of what Americans think should be happening in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, and the complete, absolute senselessness from the point of view any reasonable policy of Syrian and of Americans' actions in Syria, Iran, and Iraq and Afghanistan have come to a lot more Americans have come to the conclusion that we know this isn't about democracy, it isn't about human rights, and it isn't about fighting terrorism. Mm-hmm. It's about something else, whether it's getting the oil or, just forcing compliance. But I would say we have a long way to go still in recognizing what it is about and the ways in which, from the point of view of the people who are pursuing these policies and really advocating for these policies are very successful. They've destroyed states and weakened states and taken states off the board and that's what they want to do with Iran.
Well, Said Mohsen, now Iran sent missiles attacking the U.S. Zain al-Assad base in Iraq after the assassination of the general, inflicting a lot of damage both on troops and property. What message did that attack send? And by the U.S. not responding to that missile attack, what message did that send?
Firstly, on a domestic front, it sent a message to the Iranian people that the Islamic Republic of Iran has prepared very, very well on a military level. Their ballistic missile capability is up there with the best in the world. Still not, at number one, but it's definitely knocking around in a territory which makes it very difficult for the enemies of Iran, namely Israel and America and their allies in the West. It makes it very difficult for them to consider attacking Iran without serious consequences being reaped. Now, the second thing is that it tells the partners of the Americans and the Israelis, or the UAE and the likes of Bahrain and clandestinely Saudi Arabia, of course, these sort of nations that have been puppet governments that have operated for Zio-American imperialism in the region, have got the message that actually America and America's military might isn't necessarily going to save them. And that at the end of the day, there's going to come a day when the oil runs out and the military protection, which the Americans have supposedly offered them for all these decades, in fact, isn't as impregnable as they thought. Their Patriot missiles, etc., have been exposed, and all sorts of other systems, which are defense systems, are not necessarily as effective as presumed. And they've also seen that their real geographical long-term neighbor, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is very, very capable of, being the most powerful nation in that region. So they've got a real problem on their hands. They have to now either fall further into the laps of the Americans, or they've got to think very carefully about renegotiating their positions vis-a-vis Iran, which previously have been all about collaborating with Israel and the Americans. So we're seeing a huge turmoil there, I think, in terms of what the future of the neighbors of Iran will be.
Okay, stay with me because I'm almost out of time. Jim, let me get you back in on this. Jim, where do you see this going? I mean, you heard Sayed Mohsen talking about the overall status in the region because of that attack. After that assassination and looking at it today, did it help the United States in any way? It appears that the U.S. has lost face in the region, lost status globally, and it almost seems like it's in free fall. I mean, your assessment. We have about, 40 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, yes, politically, it's in free fall in the sense that nobody believes the stories, the narratives they give anymore. And what they are definitely trying to do now is to do something about this power that was just well described that Iran has now. They have the power to hurt Israel, the United States, and anybody who attacks them. And that's what they're trying to do with the JCPOA, is to get rid of the missile technology and the power of the resistance groups around the region that will fight on behalf of against any kind of aggression. So this is what they need to do. The United States still has an enormous amount of military power. They can do a lot of destruction to a lot of people, but they can't do it without getting hit back in a serious way.
Okay, and on that note, so sorry, I'm going to have to end it right here. Appreciate both of you being with us. Out of New York, Jim Kavanagh, writer and political commentator. Out of London, journalist and political commentator Sayed Mohsen Abbas. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another Spotlight. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.